I'm going to do something a little bit different this week. Instead of having an analysis behind the news, I made the mistake last week of mentioning something about knowing a little about voter fraud. I'm not going to get into specifics, but a lot of people have asked that I talk about it, so I'm going to do that. First of all, let's talk about a little history, because most people are not aware of the history of voting. In our country, what we did in the beginning of our country was to go and gather at the church or the meeting house or the courthouse or whatever, and we would be in a mass meeting and vote for our candidates. We'd do so in public. It was not a secret ballot. Everybody knew how each other voted. And this was done because everybody wanted a fair vote. The only way that you could get that was you would get together and all those in favor say aye. All those in favor say no. If it looked like it was a draw due to the noise, you asked people to stand. All those in favor stand. All those in favor or not in favor stand. And then they would count heads. This is where the expression came, he's a stand-up guy. Maybe you don't use that so much these days, but we used to when I was a youth. He's a real stand-up guy. Well, where that came from was if a man said something and then politically, and then he stood for that, in other words, in his vote, he was a stand-up guy. He kept his word. Well, it got to be a problem in some areas because of intimidation. There were a lot of people in those days who would intimidate other people into voting against their wishes. They wanted to vote their conviction, and so they decided they're going to have a secret ballot. Well, the problem with the secret ballot is it's not how you vote, it's who counts the votes, because it's secret. Nobody knows how other people voted, and so it became a problem as well. In addition, in those days, not every polling place was efficient. They would use scraps of paper, or maybe the same paper. Sometimes the local officials would print them. Most of the time they did not. It was not unusual, for instance, for a newspaper to be published called let's just throw out a name fictitiously, the St. Louis Democrat and the St. Louis Republican. The people that subscribed to the Democrat, they provided a sheet of all the Democratic candidates, and then you just rip that out and put it in the ballot box, and likewise for the Republican. So there was no standardization, if you will, of the ballot in many of the areas around the country. And so you could not tell, therefore, about voter fraud because there was too many slips of paper in the ballot box. Now, this wasn't as hodgepodge as I make it sound, but nonetheless it was a problem. So they started to agitate for something called the Australian Ballot around the 1880s. Now, they called it the Australian Ballot because that's what was being done in Australia, and essentially what it meant was the government would print the ballots. And so you had a uniformity across the board of the ballots in an area because of the government publishing the ballots. The problem with that became whether or not you got on the ballot. The government started to establish standards as to who could run and who couldn't run, and all different sorts of qualifications because, after all, they published the ballot. Even as late as 1990, we saw areas where candidates were deprived, legitimate candidates were deprived of getting on the ballot. For instance, with the Reform Party of Pat Buchanan, that's the party that was started by Ross Perot. Pat Buchanan won the convention of the Reform Party, was placed on the ballot in most states, but some states refused to put him on the ballot, even though the Federal Election Commission said that it was a fair and square convention and that Pat Buchanan was the Reform candidate. And instead, they put this other guy who lost the campaign, or at least the convention. So the government started to get control over who could be on the ballot, not the citizens. And so they moved forward. Then they started to have the machines. That's where you went in, and for you older people, you remember that we used to go in, and there'd be a curtain with a booth, And you'd go in and you'd pull this lever over, and that would close the curtain behind you, so it would be secret. Well, at any rate, then you had little levers, and you pushed down the levers, yes or no, on candidates and propositions and so on and so forth. When you were done, you pulled the lever back over. When you pulled the lever back over, that recorded in the machinery how you had voted. Now, this is supposed to be secret. It's supposed to be a good tabulation and everything else. But there was something wrong with that. And that was if somebody had gone around the back of the machine and moved the little dials before people started to vote. Now, what they would do is they would claim that the machines were set at 0. They would close up the machines and wire them shut and seal them, so on and so forth. But I have a friend, and this is not the only instances that I know of this, but it's the one that is recalled by my friend to me quite recently. He was a poll watcher. In this case, I don't know if it was in Georgia or Texas because he's lived in both areas. But he refused to certify that the machines were okay just by looking at them. He said, no, how can I tell if these machines are set at 0 without opening it up and look? Well, so there was a line forming and everybody was getting impatient. And he said firmly, I'm not going to certify this until we do that. So they opened up the machine. Lo and behold, the machines weren't set at 0. And you can do that in two different ways. You can set the machine so that there's more votes given or more votes taken away. For instance, let's say the machine is set to turn over at 1,000 votes. Well, if you set that, say, at 950, the candidate you don't want has to have 50 votes before it even gets to 0 to start counting again. So there's ways of doing this with the machinery that a lot of people were not aware of. At any rate, along comes computerized voting. That's going to take care of all of this. Well, the problem with that is then how do the inspectors inspect the machines? Are they software experts? I don't think so. The thing is that we know that there has been election fraud committed in this country for many, many years. There was election fraud in the 1860 election that most people are not aware of. Abraham Lincoln probably would not have been elected President of the United States except for the election fraud that was committed in the Midwest, in the states of Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan and Illinois and others. Later on, it's pretty obvious that Rutherford Hayes should not have been elected President of the United States, that it was Tilton. It went to a great length at the end to satisfy everybody and reach a compromise, but it was pretty obvious that election fraud was involved. We know that election fraud was involved in the Nixon and Kennedy election. Nixon probably was elected President of the United States rather than JFK because of the voter fraud that was committed in Chicago. Interestingly enough, the Republican Party refused to investigate and go forward with that fraud. Likewise, in California, we know of illegal voting that has happened with illegal immigrants that have taken out good men from the Congress of the United States. Again, the Republican Party refused to do anything about it. So we know those things go on. Let me tell you one more story. There was a man in the Northwest called Bob Cochran. Bob Cochran was a Democrat, and he was a TV host in the days when they used to host movies late at night. Most channels had late night movies. He would come on, and to tell you the kind of Democrat this man was, he would say, we are now going to pause for station identification because the federal government thinks you're too stupid to know what channel you're watching. At any rate, he runs for Congress. Now, there were some things that I would disagree with on the man, but he was basically an honest individual. Well, he came out in the primary, losing the primary. That turned out that the counties that he campaigned in, he lost. Came in third. But the counties he didn't campaign in, he came in first. Now he asks himself the question, what is it about my campaign that was so wrong? I went into these counties and I lose. But the counties I didn't go into, I didn't lose. Maybe there's something else about these counties that I'm not noticing right off, and they realized it was the only counties at that time that had computerized voting. He went down to a judge immediately, got an injunction on those ballots in those areas. They hand counted them. Lo and behold, he came in first in all of those counties and came through the primary. He lost the general election, but it's just one example. He wrote a book, I had a whole case of them at one time, I haven't got one left, that documented the problem with computerized voting. Got very interested in the subject, as you can well imagine. And that, as a result of this investigation and everything else, which never got any publicity, we came out in the John Birch Society with the opinion that we should go back to paper ballots. At least that way, when you open up the box, the 3 judges can hand count them and post them there for everyone to see. You can't corrupt every precinct, is what we're saying. With computerized voting, you can corrupt the whole process. It's very dangerous and something that we have to watch out for. I'd like to talk more about this subject, but I'm out of time. We'll see you next week.